Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news around the world. Today is Friday, October 14th. A lot of news to talk about. We'll start with Ukraine, in which escalation of fighting and of bombing seems to have changed the nature of the war yet again. Then we'll take a look at Saudi Arabia and its deteriorating relationships with Washington after OPEC Plus started to raise prices by reducing production. And finally, a look at North Korea, where the North Koreans are exercising nuclear warfare and putting airplanes in large numbers in the air close to the South Korean border. Here to discuss all of this with us this week is Elise Labott, the founder of Zivvy Media and contributing writer for Politico magazine. Elise, great to have you back.
Great to be with you.
And Peter Spiegel, the U.S. managing editor of the Financial Times. Great to see you again, Peter.
Thanks for having me back, Ivo.
And Stefan Kornelius, who is the political editor of the Süddeutsche Zeitung. Stefan, wonderful to have you back as well.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with you, Stefan. Ukraine, lots of things happening just in the last week. A bombing of the bridge across the Kerch Straits between Crimea and Russia, and then 4 nights of unrelenting missile attacks on Ukrainian cities in response, while the war on the ground seems to be continuing in the favor of Ukraine. NATO was meeting, lots of things happening. Sort of bring us up to date and put it in perspective where you think 8+ months into this war we are now.
Well, where are we? This is the key question. I mean, this is definitely a remarkable week, which saw the escalation on 2 sides, both militarily but also politically. And that's the interesting part, because for the first time for so many months, we've now seen some political movement, but I'll come to that in a second. Militarily, you mentioned the bridge, the Kerch Bridge, which links Russia with Crimea. It's a major supply line, a major strategic hold for Russia on Crimea. And it's also a symbol of national pride and of Putin's strength, which was bombed, which was severely damaged, which was allegedly reused after that. The Russians make an attempt to make us believe that the bridge can be used. Well, there are opposing informations on that. But nevertheless, that bombing caused a retaliatory moment for Russia, which now hails day after night rockets on Ukraine territory, on cities as far west as Lviv, but also the capital Kiev and other places. That military escalation caused a lot of thinking on how long that can actually be sustained. The British military intelligence, which seems to have taken over the role as sort of the public speakerphone for all military things and assessments, claims that Russia's pile of arsenal of rockets is vastly diminished now, that it is they're running out of weaponry, and that this will bring Putin into some major trouble as his air superiority might dwindle. On the other side, the West in this week as well supplied Ukraine again with exactly the weapons against those kind of missiles, mostly Germany delivering 1 major air defense system. 2 are supposed to follow within the next months. And in this week also the meeting of the famous Rammstein group, the group which supplies, or actually from the West, organizes supply for Ukraine defense, met in Brussels under the helm of the American Defense Secretary. And they basically went around the table collecting all things necessary for that war. So that's the military side. Most interesting for me, however, was the political side, where we saw 2 things unfolding. First, in the United Nations chambers, a debate on the nuclear threat of Russia, and also on that escalation now we saw and I just talked about. And a remarkable 143 votes of UN member states voting against Russia annexing the territories which it did last week. So the annexation was now prone to a political assessment, and a number never as big before made clear that that kind of policy by Russia would not be followed anywhere in the world, with just 5 supporting countries. the usual suspects. Then we had the G7 meeting, also by surprise, and the G7 released a statement on Wednesday, which for the first time, for those who really were reading carefully, hinted at some kind of preparedness to negotiate. And now this is the most striking feature for me of that week overall. We had President Biden reacting to an offer by the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov for negotiations. Lavrov said, well, we're ready to negotiate. You just have to make the first step, talking to the West. And Biden sort of turning around on the heels, and CNN gave an interview and said, well, I wouldn't turn down Putin if I would meet him in the margins of the G20 meeting in November in Indonesia, if he would talk not about Ukraine, but on the release of the American basketball player. So that is an interesting move. So both sides, in an attempt to signal that there is a kind of preparedness to move ahead on talk. And I had my sort of personal observations this week, where I did the rounds in Berlin and Brussels, and actually came back with the impression that there is serious thinking going on about how to proceed now politically, where we could use this momentum to filter anything substantial out of it, because everyone sees this. Putin is probably realizing he's getting in the defensive. He has to do something about it if he wants to survive this. Otherwise, he will be pressed in the corner and axed away. And assessment by the intelligence people I talked to is that he's still totally under control and would be still able to turn things around and call this to an end. So it's a question of the right momentum. And on the other side, on the Ukrainian side, the difficulty is how to stabilize Zelensky in a way that his hardline people who want to fight back Crimea would hold back the moment he would tell them, listen, this is not in the books right now. We'll find some sort of intermediate solution with a neutral territory guarded by the United Nations, for example, something like that. I mean, a lot of models are up there in the air, but at least they are talking.
Stefan, can I ask, because I think a lot of the diplomatic chatter is being driven by events on the ground. And you obviously mentioned Kerch Bridge and the missile strikes in Kiev and elsewhere. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about sort of what's happening in Donbass, because we did see some of the initial signs that the pocket around Kherson was beginning to collapse, where much like further up in the north, some of the regional governors saying we have to evacuate people from the Kherson area. But then you had the Russians sort of respond by appointing yet another new commander for the region, Sergei Surovikin, who is, by reputation anyway, he's known as General Armageddon, sort of the butcher of Syria. I guess I'm just curious your assessment about those two things and whether and how they drive the diplomatic discussion, because I think there's been, frankly, we, the FT, and I think Elise's former employer at CNN have made a big deal about this change of command in Russia. But I guess I'm somewhat skeptical that even a change of command is going to change the situation on the ground, given that the Russians are still struggling to find capable troops to fight back. Do you have a sense as to what is actually happening on the ground there?
Well, I think on the ground in the south, in Cherson, which we were mentioning, we do see very slow approaches by the Ukrainians. They are successful, but it's not really going fast. And that's because this region is still heavily manned by the Russians, which do have supply problems, major supply problems, and do withdraw voluntarily because they can't defend themselves anymore. And on the north, in the Kharkiv area, you don't see Ukraine advancing that much more anymore, because it's basically open field. They could if they would, but that would bind troops. That would take them away necessary fighting power, which they need in the south. My naive assessment is we are already seeing preparations on where does things stop and where do we hold. And definitely the Ukrainian strategic goal would be to cut off Russia from the access to Crimea in the south as well, sort of the landline coming in from Ukraine, and approach as close as far as possible towards Mariupol, which was prior to the war controlled by Ukraine. And is Ukrainian, to be correct, precise here. It's not Russian at all, even if they claim it would be. Now, that's the military side. And the commander issue, I think, is much more important for the Russian internal domestic consumption than for us. They had a lot of good commanders in the field, and they all lost. And they didn't lose because they were bad commanders. They lost because this whole structure of the Russian army doesn't work. So that new commander can't work wonders. And I think since he has such a reputation as of being the slaughterer of something, he might at least appease the hardline faction in Moscow, which demands now heavy retaliation.
Elise, I think there's sort of two political issues that are sort of driving the military narrative. One is this point that Stefan just mentioned of hardliners inside Russia wanting Putin to do more, and that's why we're seeing this salvo of missiles being launched, which frankly have no military impact on the situation on the ground. They have an impact on the civilian leadership, but then also certainly Biden, just not only the CNN interview, also this, I guess it was a week ago when he warned about nuclear war, talked for the first time in a long time about an off-ramp for Putin. And sort of building on Stefan's point, there is this worry that if you put Putin too much into the corner, then you'd leave him nothing but escalation. And is there a way out? So when you talk to folks in Washington, are you seeing a greater appreciation of the need to find a way to out of this conflict that at least allows Putin not to have to escalate?
Exactly. I mean, we on this program had spoken early on about, always providing that off ramp for Putin because, at various points in this conflict, Putin was kind of like a caged animal almost. And what happens with a wounded animal? They're very emotional. They're very irrational. And so I think there's always been that in the back of the U.S. mind as the Ukrainians became more powerful, showed that really they could show more resilience against Russia. I think maybe there was less talk about that. And then there was a kind of euphoria. Well, maybe the Ukrainians could win this thing. But I think there's a realization that this is going to have to be done through negotiations. And the idea is, can the Ukrainians get strong enough to the point where they can sit down with Putin at the table and negotiate an end that works for, both sides? I do think everybody paid attention to the Armageddon remarks. And, Putin's kind of the whole idea that Putin's emotion and irrationality and his appetite for escalation affecting his decision-making. Would he use a nuclear weapon? And then there was all this talk about a small tactical nuclear weapon. And then there was, all this talk about whether a nuclear weapon could be used. And I think that what was really important was Biden's idea about providing an off-ramp. We're in this cycle right now where the Ukrainians are strong. Putin has suffered not only battlefield losses, but humiliating losses to him, the destruction of the bridge linking Crimea to Russia on his birthday, no less. He had to call up conscripts. The idea that Putin is looking very bad also makes him very emotional. So it's how far do you support the Ukrainians in their battle against Russia that makes them stronger, that sees the kind of reaction that Stefan was describing, and this, punishing week of strikes that just continues this. That's the kind of cycle we're in right now. And I think, talks on, nuclear stability between the US and Russia, they didn't necessarily go so well. But I think the more that as Peter and Stefan were saying, the more that they can have these conversations that lower the temperature, I think is going to be helpful, because September was a very difficult month for Putin. It was a very good month for Ukraine. And so the scales are keep teetering between one another. You can't fix this on the military battlefield. So you got to get some negotiations going where both sides feel that they're strong enough to sit at the table, I think.
Ivo, can I just jump in here with a slightly a different view? Because I am highly skeptical and have remained highly skeptical for some time about the prospect of actual negotiations. I think mainly from a political point of view. I think we will have domestic populations in all of our countries, and by all of our countries, I mean sort of the NATO alliances, that are still, the Ukrainians are good at this. I mean, they're very good at ginning up international support for them. The minute that someone is seen as breaking from the international coalition to cut a deal with Putin, I think they're going to get slammed by Zelensky and by his crew, I think you also do have a genuine risk of splintering the coalition, because you got the Baltics and Poland in particular who will cry bloody murder, saying Chamberlain, you're negotiating with Hitler and this kind of stuff. I think it's going to be very difficult to, short of complete victory in Ukraine, to try to say just stop here.
Though? My question is, I think, clearly the Ukrainians are doing well, but are they doing well enough that they're really going to bring Russia to its knees with a kind of white flag and end this thing that way? The question is, what I'm trying to say is, can the Ukrainians get, kind of strong enough to the point where, maybe Russia declares an end to the war or something?
I think you're right normatively. I just think politically you're going to run into challenges. Again, the allusions to Hitler are wheeled out at every single conflict. But I do think you have a good portion of Western society, particularly in Poland and the Baltics, who feels that any negotiation with Putin is negotiation with a Hitler-like figure, and you're going to get accusations of Chamberlain, and you run the risk of splintering a coalition, an alliance that has, for the first time in many decades, as Ivo knows better than any of us, have been seen as brain dead and dysfunctional. So I think again, from a purely normative point of view, what should be done, I think you're 100% right, or what could be done. I just think that from a political point of view, that's a very, very difficult bridge to cross, and I'm very skeptical that it will be able to be done. How
does it end? I don't want to take Ivo's thunder, but I'm just curious how you think it ends then. I think the U.S. is digging in for a very, protracted conflict, and, officials have told me, I think we'll be here next year, but how ultimately does this end?
Look, I think you're all right that we've heard different rhetoric coming out of Washington, both in the CNN interview and also, Ivo, as you pointed out, some of the other remarks that Biden have made. But it's not that long ago that the British government and the U.S. government was publicly saying regime change, right? You had Austin, you had Liz Truss, who of course maybe not be long for this world, both articulating that. And I do think at some point it is going to be very difficult to engage with the Russians without a new leader. Now, as Stefan pointed out earlier, there is no sign, despite some reporting that there's been infighting within the Kremlin, there is no sign he has any lack of control over the levers of power. So I don't think that is necessarily a likely short-term outcome. So I do think we're just going to continue grinding away here. And it does raise the risk of Putin going nuclear, but I don't think he is actually feeling his own position threatened. So I'm not actually I am less concerned than others about him going to the nuclear option. Let's just put it that way.
And Biden in the CNN interview actually also changed the tune on the nuclear side, in which he said it was, he didn't think it was very likely. I think the administration is trying to thread a needle, which it has tried to do all along. And the key is how much military advance can Ukraine gain, particularly into the winter months. I think Stefan rightly says the fundamental goal is to cut Crimea off from the Russian mainland, and that means you need to recapture Kherson. You need to recapture the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia, and push a little further east. And at that point, there's territorial problems, but there's no more the political issues are less. And I just, I don't see any Western leader, and I Stefan, correct me if I'm wrong, I would include Olaf Scholz, who would push for negotiations unless the Ukrainians were willing to negotiate. And so I think that's the strategy. The strategy is to find a point at which the Ukrainians are comfortable to at least add a diplomatic dimension to the military dimension and use the military advantages that they have to get a better deal. But we're not going to go out there and negotiate. I don't see Putin and Biden negotiating without the Ukrainians there. That's just not going to happen.
Right.
If I can have two thoughts on this. My sources tell me this is exactly what you say. We need to find that landing zone, and we don't know where it's yet. And it is definitely not a landing zone which can be preempted from us and which can be figured out from the West and given over to the Ukrainians to work with. So this is the most important thing. The second one is, Peter, be careful what you wish for in terms of negotiating with or not with Putin. You might get it. And so right now, my sources are much more comfortable negotiating with Putin or getting this over with Putin rather than with any kind of unknown leader who might come next and who is definitely not easier to handle. And the third thing is that it's the first time now that I heard this week the political side talking about sort of models which can be thought, but there is consensus that the Russians cannot be rewarded at all. So we are talking about status quo ante minus. There has to be something less than they had before on the 24th of February. And that minus could be definitely handing over the occupied areas to some neutral force like the UN or whoever takes charge of it. And then we'll find a political solution for Crimea and that core Donbas area we were seeing earlier. But for that, militarily, we would need to see the Ukrainian army marching far more to the east, getting Mariupol back and other places. So that would be a substantial change, and then the landscape will definitely change. But right now, if you talk about political solutions too early, you just cause the opposite. You cause the radicals to rise, and you make Zelensky's life hell, you make Biden's life hell, you might make everyone's life hell. So it takes time.
And increasingly, I think there's a recognition across the West that's where we are, and we need to stick together. Just reinforcing, I think, a point that many of us made: the likelihood of the West splitting on this issue is getting less and less rather than more and more, because frankly, the situation splitting doesn't mean that you get what you want. If a German government or a French government says we need negotiations, if you don't have the Ukrainians on board, there are no negotiations, and therefore you're kind of stuck in this way. So, the bad news is we will be talking about this next week because it's not going to be resolved anytime soon. But it's a very glad, Stefan, you brought in the political dimension. I think it's being lost to some extent by the military euphoria that we've seen over the past few weeks that Elise talked about. Let's switch on to another really tricky issue, Elise. The Saudi-U.S. relationship, not very good under Biden, under the best of circumstances, but it seemed to have been rebuilt with the visit that the president made in July. Now seems to be as bad as it's been, as bad as it's been ever in some ways, with the president saying that they were reassessing the relationship and the Saudis not particularly perturbed by that. Bring us up to date. Why are we in this situation, and how big is this debate about the relationship between the United States and Saudi, and how is that going to affect the way forward?
Well, in the last few days, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries plus Russia, this OPEC plus cartel, announced it would reduce production by 2 billion barrels a day. That was after over the summer, just before President Biden went to Saudi Arabia, it announced that it would increase production. And of course, this comes a month before the U.S. Election. Biden and the Democrats are looking to keep gas prices lower. And they were, under the impression, and there were, some assurances by the Saudis and OPEC Plus that they would keep production at a level that would keep oil prices down. OPEC Plus said that the supply cut was aimed at stabilizing the oil markets, preemptively meeting a kind of weakening economy. They see inflation, they see a recession coming, and they're anticipating less of a demand for oil. So they say that they're kind of preemptively going to that. And the U.S. is accusing Saudi of weaponing oil prices, saying that they're just trying to get ahead of a potential reduction in demand, and that the Saudis coerced these smaller producing members to agree to production cuts to basically benefit Russia. And so the Democrats are up in arms, saying that Saudi is siding with Russia. They're saying there's no basis to cut the production, and basically there's a he said, she said in terms of why production was cut. The Saudis are saying, this, you're being very emotional about this. We're being very practical about this. This is part of a cartel's decision. Some of these smaller producing countries can't actually have the production to meet the targets. And we're anticipating, again, a recession. But basically, the larger story here is the relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, which, as you say, was really kind of in the at the lowest point in years. And so under the Biden administration, President Biden, just to recap, came in saying he was going to treat the Saudis as a pariah for the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, which the intelligence community assessed that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was involved. After a good year and a half of trying to keep the Saudis at bay, realized we do need the Saudis. We do need them for oil. We do need them against Russia. Went to Saudi Arabia, that notorious fist bump, and I would say came away from that trip between the Saudi relationship with the U.S. was more on an upswing. There was an understanding not just about oil, but about further global cooperation. And this, a month before the elections, they feel, the administration feels slapped in the face. And the Saudis are saying, it's not our fault that you haven't increased production in the U.S., that you haven't refined enough oil, that you haven't built refineries in years. And so again, both sides are looking at this through their own lens, and the relationship is suffering. Now the Democrats are proposing legislation that would not only target this OPEC plus cartel, but also deny Saudi arms sales for the next year. And, it's really even worse than it was, I would say, before President Biden's trip. President Biden saying he's going to reevaluate the relationship. I don't know how practical that is on either side, but both sides think they can live without each other. But as we saw before the trip this year, both sides realized that, although they're hedging against themselves in other ways, Biden is talking to the Iranians and Venezuelans about increasing their oil production, while the Saudis are looking towards Russia and China as more, global kind of superpower type countries. But we see that neither one of those options, given the geostrategic landscape, is really very practical.
Elise, can I ask you to parse a little bit the statements of the last 24, 48, 72 hours? Because frankly, we've had a debate internally about what some of this means. I mean, as you said, within the U.S., it kind of started on the Hill. You had sort of Bob Menendez and Dick Durbin, and then the legislation introduced on NOPEC against the OPEC cartel, but then threats to sort of, stop supporting the Saudi defense sector, because basically most of it is funded and operated by the U.S. Then it went to John Kirby, who did the first initial talking about revaluing the relationship, and then Biden himself said it. And then the Saudi side, which I hadn't really seen before, I couldn't remember the last time this happened. You did have actually long statements being put out. Like it was yesterday, maybe, and then you had the foreign ministry again today. Again, if you read it very closely, it's sort of a little bit for everyone. I mean, some of our particular oil guys here at the FT said, "Oh, clearly they're going to make a U-turn. They're going to have to reverse this now." I can see this in paragraph 5 and paragraph 7. I frankly read it as a little bit also a bit of a panic. They're panicking because they realized they weren't aware that the Americans were to come on so hard. Although, frankly, behind the scenes, we heard there was a lot of warnings going on in meetings with the Saudis beforehand. Do you have any sense of where the Saudis' head is right now, and whether they are thinking about reversing course? Because you do have the Emiratis and some others who seem to be siding with the U.S. on this.
Well, the Emiratis kind of go back and forth, right? They don't want anybody mad at them. They want to be, chummy with everybody in OPEC, but they also want to keep their, good status with the U.S. So whatever, each day, whatever benefits them, I think that's what they'll do. This is really about the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. And I think if you look, the EU steps to ban Russian oil imports and the G7 plan to cap the price of oil and tighten the oil markets, that's going to affect oil markets in itself. And I do think that they're going to have to reverse that decision and increase production. And I think they know that. I think it's a little bit, I do agree in some sense that it's an emotional response to think it's all about the Saudis wanting to stick it to Biden and, not wanting to help him in the election. The Saudis are in it for themselves. They want to make money. They are trying to diversify their economy, and they want to make money on the oil wherever they can, as long as they can. And so you may see a lot of these, increase and decrease and increase and decrease over the next several years that are based purely in self-interest. I think it was a little bit short-sighted of them to do this a month before the election, but at the same time, the Saudis are saying, is it our responsibility to help you win the election? We can't be seen, on one hand, we can't be seen as helping you. On the other hand, we can't be seen as hurting you. We have to really stick to where the oil markets are telling us to go. And I think that there are some analysts on one hand that say cutting off oil production right now when inflation is high threatens to worsen inflation and worsen the oil market. And then there were analysts that say that maybe the OPEC Plus hasn't been forecasting the dip in demand enough. And so, the analysts are a little bit all over the place. I think this is really about, whether the Saudis are willing to sacrifice their short-term gain in increased oil prices for the sake of the relationship with the U.S. The U.S. is pissed. I mean, sorry for my crass language, but this is a snub. How could you do this to your friend? They really are taking it personal right now. And they're saying, we showed you could wait a month. They're making it political. They're saying that the Saudis are doing it politically, but in essence, by saying, wait a month, they're making it political too. And so that's what I think, it goes into the, domestic political scene just before the midterms. And I think it's really fascinating, but the Saudis are saying, take emotion out of it. Adel Al-Jubeir was on Fox a couple days ago, the former foreign minister who's got a lot of titles now, Minister of State, and certainly is still advisor to MBS, the Crown Prince, is saying it's not our fault you haven't handled your own domestic production issues, your decrease in demand for oil, your move to renewables. We've been telling you this for years, and we're trying to stabilize the oil markets in the short term and for the long term. And we've been telling you for years, and they did say this back over the summer, that you need to get your own oil production, domestic demand, move to renewables and refineries house in order, and stop looking for us to do your job.
I will just say I am highly, if I can just one last on this, I am highly skeptical. I am highly skeptical of the Saudi claims that they're only doing this for oil market.
I'm not saying.
I mean, they are incredibly
what they're saying. But
the fact of the matter is, they spent years driving down the price of oil to destroy the U.S. domestic shale industry.
But often I'm not defending the Saudis. I'm saying often at the U.S. request. Don't you remember when Trump asked them to decrease production and he decreased production? I mean, is it, I think it's a little bit, I'm not saying that they didn't wantonly disregard what was good for Biden or not, but I really honestly don't think this was a personal slight to Biden.
Well, look, the last thing I'll say on this is there were very senior American diplomats who flew to meet the Saudis, who were enraged after meeting with them. The Saudis knew this would anger the Americans. And if there's any country in the world that could deal and thrive, frankly, from low oil prices, it's Saudi Arabia, because they're the cheapest oil producer in the world. So
I don't disagree. But I'm asking you now, you think it was a personal political snub to Biden? The guy's there for 2 more years. I mean,
I do, as a matter of fact. I think what we've seen over the course of 4 years of the Trump administration, there's been no more pro-Saudi president in the history of the United States, I would argue, than Donald Trump. You've gotten the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund giving Jared Kushner $2 billion for his new venture capital fund. This is a regime in Saudi Arabia that wants to push Biden. And Biden has been the most anti-Saudi president I think we've had in modern history. I think they have made their calculation that the Biden administration is bad for them geopolitically. And they've made the calculation the Republican Party that is still under the sway of Trump is good for them. And I don't think that is a unusual calculation for a sovereign nation to make when they're making the geopolitical decisions. But I think it's highly political.
Stefan, this conversation shows that Europe is a bystander when it comes to this.
But it's not. Affected,
right?
Really.
But it's right. It's not
the curve. Yeah.
Right. So how? I mean, particularly given the EU oil embargo that is going to be coming in the end of the year, the price cap that has just been agreed. Oil markets matter a great deal to people in Europe. In fact, in some ways more so, particularly with the rising dollar, which is how oil gets purchased, leading to higher prices and high inflation as well. So how has this kerfuffle, which seems to be a family feud, although people are deciding that they need a divorce as part of the family feud, you're the children. No, wrong metaphor. You're in the middle of this feud with extraordinarily consequences also for Europe. What do folks in Berlin and Brussels tell you about this?
Well, this is ground zero of the global energy problem. I'm sitting here in my sweater because my company decided to turn down the heat. So we are saving energy as much as we can. This is a real economic problem. It's turning out to be the major societal stress factor for that coming winter all over Europe. You do have major demonstrations in France where they are not supplying gas stations anymore. The refineries are on strike. We had an oil pipeline leak from the Druzhba pipeline coming from Russia this week, obviously by coincidence or accident, whatever. We had the gas pipelines being blown up in the Baltic Sea, which were out of use anyway. Nevertheless, it shows Europe is not a bystander. It's sort of basically the battlefield. And the market price, the market share and how oil is distributed is totally affecting Europe. We do have European leaders traveling to North Africa, to the Saudi Arabia constantly. The chancellor getting snubs from Saudi Arabia and others, which are not willing to share higher quotas with Europe. Now they're begging in Washington that the U.S. is supplying with higher quotas of oil. So in the end, Europe is the weakest part in that chain. And I fully understand the domestic repercussions in the U.S. prior to the midterms. But then again, just read their national security strategy, which was released today, and read what's being said about the Middle East. So that's coming somewhere far back there. And so you wonder, as a Saudi reader, how much business am I in with this country anymore?
I mean, I think the White House is well aware of the point that Stefan makes about the importance in Europe, and I think the reason they're really, really angry is actually not political. It is that fundamentally, at a time when Europe and the United States have come together at great cost in Europe, far more so than in the United States, where the cost has been inflation, to put pressure on the Saudis, on the Russians. The Saudis gave them a lifeline. And for what? So they could sell oil at $100 a barrel rather than $90 a barrel, even it costs $7 a barrel to produce it. And so I think that's the real underlying reason. The Saudis did vote against the Russians in the General Assembly. They were one of the 143 that were there. But at the same time, so were the UAE. The MBZ, the head of UAE, was in Russia meeting with Putin. And I think the real issue is on whose side in this fundamental fight are you on? And I think the Saudis have decided they're on the Russian side. They're not on the side of the West. And that's where everything else really becomes a big issue. And why I don't think this is not a momentary blip in the relationship. I think it's a fundamental break that is going to have a real impact on the future. And I think Stefan's right. The Middle East has never been critically important to this administration, and I can't see it being critically important for many administrations in the future, given what's going on with China and everything else. We have 5 minutes left, Peter, and actually, this sort of it underscores the point.
It's emblematic. Exactly. I could say exactly that. Yeah.
We just don't pay attention to North Korea, and North Korea is the kind of country, when you don't pay attention to them, they figure out a way to make sure that you start paying attention. And they've been doing that in spades in the last couple of weeks. And if you live in Korea, in South Korea or in Japan or anywhere in the region, you're paying a lot of attention. So bring us up to date of where we are.
Yeah, I mean, it is emblematic that because of the Saudi drama and the Ukraine drama, that we haven't paid attention to North Korea. And I think when the North Koreans fire a missile over Japan, our brains go, oh, they do this periodically to get attention. But I think what people are missing here is the scale of what the North Koreans are up to right now. And I think, frankly, even the U.S. Government is missing it to a certain extent, because not only do you have their periodic firing of missiles over the islands of Japan, the scale and number of missile tests have gone up exponentially, and particularly short-range missiles, which are much more a threat to the South Koreans in particular. I mean, almost a doubling over the last year in number of missile tests. Bring that also along with, as you mentioned, Ivo, that they're now using Air Force scrambling their jets as part of nuclear drills coming up to the South Korean border. Kim announced a change in their nuclear posture, publicly declaring themselves a nuclear power, publicly declaring that they have a first strike option with their nuclear weapons. So the rhetoric coming out of North Korea has gone up exponentially as well. The other thing, which I think, again, we in the West have not clocked either, is a change in leadership in South Korea in May, which went from a Moon regime, which was desperate for reunification talks and peace talks, to a much more hardliner, unknown, frankly, politician in South Korea, who has talked during the campaign, at least, of being much more hardline with the North Koreans, so that tensions have gone up between them. And we also have post-Trump, post-COVID resumption of U.S. South Korean military exercises, which are also spooking the North Koreans. So I think if you put all those data points together, this is not yet just another Kim Jong-un trying to get attention from the West, as we're distracted with other things by firing a missile over the Japanese islands. This is over the course of months, a serious ratcheting up of tensions on the peninsula that I think, frankly, we are so distracted with that we haven't paid enough attention to it. And by we, I don't mean just the U.S. government. I think, frankly, we in the media as well, because it's a step change here. And I think we do run the risk of tripping into something really horrible, as the North Koreans seem to be signaling that they're willing to go more nuclear. The last thing I'll say on this is the great fear from on picking up in the Pentagon is miniaturization. The inability to pair a small-sized nuclear device with a long-range missile is the one saving grace that I think the West has viewed when they're watching the North Korean weapons program. It's very, very difficult to do that, and that gives the West a little bit of an out, because you have no delivery system. I think the fear is now that there is a test in the works which will demonstrate the North Koreans have been able to miniaturize, and that's a game changer. If they're able to show that they can miniaturize to the extent that they can put it on top of a missile and not just reach Korea and Japan, but other treaty allies in the region, and frankly, even in Hawaii and other bits of the U.S. mainland, that's where things start getting really, really dangerous. So I'm glad we were able to mention it. It's only 5 minutes, I know, but as you said, Ivo, it is emblematic that we're so distracted with other national security crises that we're maybe not paying attention enough to what's going on in North Korea right now.
Yeah, actually, you did that in 3 minutes, so that was great. Elise, you wanted to jump in, and final comment. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's pretty clear that the last 30 years of policy on trying to get North Korea to denuclearize is not working. And as Peter says, as the program grows, as the North Koreans signal that they want to go even more nuclear, there's a lot of attention now on development of smaller tactical nuclear weapons that can be used against South Korea or Japan. A lot of analysts and a lot of experts are saying, look, the genie's out of the bottle. It's time to, if not recognize, then tacitly accept that North Korea is a nuclear state, and that efforts now need to be on trying to regulate that, getting North Korea to curb, if not its nuclear ambitions, then its nuclear activity. Because, trying to get talks and sanctions and all this stuff, it's not working. The North Korean program is only growing. And now, last month, Kim Jong-un amended North Korea's nuclear doctrine to allow for preemptive nuclear strikes. So, a lot of people are saying it's time to go the way of India and Pakistan and say, keep your nuclear weapons in a box, keep it in your, and don't be like we do with Israel, like don't be flaunting it, but efforts to get North Korea to denuclearize are over. And, it's time to start accepting the North Korean nuke.
I'd add one thing. I think that is a debate that is ripe, because I think, the definition of insanity is keep on doing over and over and over the same thing and expecting a different result. The other thing that I think that emerged also in this last week is that there is now a fundamental split between the United States, South Korea, and Japan on one hand, and China and Russia on the other. Of course, the Russians have become much closer with the Koreans. They're buying ammunition from the North Koreans in order to fuel the war, and I'm sure that the Koreans would like something in return. And Russia and China oppose the effort in the Security Council to condemn the violation of UN Security Council resolutions by the Koreans. And so that split, the competition we now have that was at the core of the national security strategy that the Biden administration released this year, is starting to have an impact on even those issues where you would have hoped, nuclear proliferation being one of them, that there was this kind of cooperation. That's the danger of the world that we're facing, unfortunately. We'll need to spend more time on North Korea, because I do think it is the kind of issue that literally can blow up in our face if we don't spend enough time on that. In the meantime, we did spend a lot of time on other issues and got the update. Peter, thanks so much on Korea. I want to thank Peter Spiegel, Elise Labott, and Stefan Kornelius for a really insightful discussion about so many issues. I want to thank everyone for tuning in and watching, and we'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, bon weekend.